Hi everyone, welcome to week 11. This week we're going to be thinking about land as pedagogy by thinking with the article we read by Leanne Bedesamoke-Simpson. And we're also going to be thinking about this idea of incommensurability and what it has to do with ethics. So just to start us off, as we're approaching the end of the course, I want to return to some of the key course questions that we thought together in that very first meeting that we had. So throughout the course, we have explored various theoretical perspectives that shape how pedagogy is enacted in early childhood spaces, and we've tried to make these theoretical orientations visible. Though they often go unnoticed. So we've discussed histories of knowledge formation that date back to the Enlightenment period, and even before then, considering how knowledge from the past continues to inscribe dominant discourses about how one ought to live in the world and for what purpose. Unsettling the patriarchal structures of thought, we've unpacked the construction of modernity and the modern school. And we've discussed how, during the Enlightenment period, particular ways of knowing were privileged in early scholarship and study. So scientific reason enabled a separation of the human from the living world in motion, and under the guise of objectivity, it placed the male white human as superior to nature and ecology. So as men classified and categorized the world into knowable structures, social hierarchies were formed not only in academic disciplines and with regard to what counts as knowledge, but also to social hierarchies of plant, human, and animal life that continued to place white-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual males at the pinnacle of this tier. So this research and knowledge at the time and still now is assumed to be neutral, apolitical, and void of subjective human interpretation. It's just assumed as a given truth. It continues to legitimate and is legitimated by its own political interests. So it enabled the displacement and genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada under the idea of research and of education. And as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says, it continues to inscribe divergent histories and ancestries with history, or his story, that of the white male. So we've discussed how these histories of education continue to create, through their structures, social hierarchies that enable affordances to people in particular positionalities. So thinking with Foucauldian theory and with feminist perspectives, we've discussed how schools are non-neutral spaces and are continually mediated within discourses of race, class, and gender. So we've interrogated the early childhood space as well as a place of inherent non-neutrality, of non-innocence, and one that is often marked by developmental discourse that continue to serve neoliberal pursuits in subject formation, the production of a particular human that will continue colonial expansion via consumption and linear growth. We've also discussed pedagogy, and following Cristina Delgado Vintimilla, we think about pedagogy as that which thinks, studies, and orients education, its purposes, its protagonists, its histories, its relations, and processes. We've considered that pedagogy is always interrogating and responding to the conditions of our time and its status quo, that which we assume to be common or given. Pedagogy, again, is interested in the creation of an experience that will produce particular forms of subjectivity. And this is radically different than developmentalism that's interested in producing a skilled individual. Pedagogy, rather, is interested in relations and responses to places and times, not solely the individual progressing in isolation and growing in production. So pedagogy then has very different accountabilities, ethical accountabilities, not only to the child, but also to the collective in which she is immediately made of and with as a part of. While developmental theory assumes universal objective growth patterns outside of social constructions and histories as if it's an objective truth, pedagogy is reliant on histories, implications, tensions, and relations. So in the forum last week, actually, first I just want to note these two questions that I asked you at the beginning of the course. The first one is, how does my daily practice contribute to creating the child as a particular type of subject? How am I governing myself by embodying discourses in my thinking and practice? So I hope that throughout this course, and as we continue to think throughout this course, that you've been thinking about these questions and how your practice is implicated within these discourses and with these ongoing theories, often of child development, but also now thinking toward reconceptualist theory as a possible alternative vision of what might be possible in our work as educators, and that we are creating subjects and we are embodying discourses, whether we're attentive of them or not. But what I hope is that through this course we've been making visible how it is that these theories and discourses are alive, how they're visible in our work. So in the forum last week, several of you discussed an idea that was posed by Yazbek, Danis, Wilson, Dixon, and Nelson in one of the Common Worlds microblogs. They tell us that our approach shapes what we know. Our approach shapes what we know. How we view the subject is based on our theoretical orientation. Whether we notice it or not, these ideas and assumptions about who the child is, who we are as educators, what early childhood education is for, comes from somewhere, and it is active in everything that we do. This knowledge creates our educative practices, and that is why we always need to return to the question as educators is, who is the child? What is education for? What are our practices in the service of? And the answers to these questions make visible your theoretical orientation, and thus the kind of world that you seek to create through processes of educating. So again, returning to our first week together, I offered you this quote by Claire Bishop, and she's an art historian and critic, and she says, "The public sphere in which our conversations are located are riven with the subversive and erased, and thus remains democratic only insofar as its naturalized exclusions are taken into account and made open to contestation." So in this course, again, we've tried to highlight and render visible the ways in which dominant practices in early childhood education, historically and currently, continue to privilege particular bodies over others, how the colonial and racialized foundations of Western knowledge continue to appropriate difference or alterity into the same Western frameworks without changing the subject itself. And thus difference remains either an exclusion, as it doesn't fit with the status quo, or it becomes absorbed into the same, into these structures, and difference is lost again. So in this sense, and as we've discussed in previous weeks, representation or inclusion isn't necessarily an effective or like a radical way of really changing educational practices, because we are bringing what's different into an already existing structure, which really continues to perpetuate the system itself. And I want to offer you this image that I think is really common when we're thinking about inclusion, and also about accounting for and accompanying difference in traditional education settings. On the left, there's this image of equality, where everybody has the same box so that they can, and looking over the fence, they don't get to see everything because everybody has the same. Everybody's given the same opportunity and has to work with it from there. Equity is a different perspective, which aims to seek plurality by giving individuals what they need. So there's a difference in how people are allocated services in order so that they can participate fully. So both of these images seek to help, or in some ways are positioning people along this fence. So consider the fence as the structure of education. And in our context, we can think about, considering we're in early childhood, we can think about child development. The structures of this fence are educational structures. So what if we move past the boxes, the box theories, and think towards the fence itself? What if it's the fence itself, the very structure of education that needs to change, rather than creating different creative ways for people to participate in an already colonizing system? So thinking from a reconceptualist perspective that we've been taking up in this course, especially of post-human and social constructivist theory, learning is not an individual pursuit, but rather knowledge is made in relations with others. So these theoretical perspectives assumes that difference ought to be maintained. Difference is necessary for multiplicity and for divergence. It assumes that things and people are incommensurable. That is, they're not comparable against one another, nor can they be measured or thought of in the same ways. Rather, a social constructivist or a post-human theoretical perspective would think about the possibility of encounters beyond the individual child, and thinking of multiple participants and multiple components alive in an event where each is open to be affected by the other. So in an encounter, there's a middle space when two meet, and where in that meeting there's a translation that activates communication and an openness to change, new understandings, or some kind of becoming. Here, encounters involve a reenacting, a reconstructing of social experiences and knowledges. And meaning is made in these relational spaces between two, where ideas collide, something is affected and produced. So in compositional experiences such as this, what happens to power? Is it smoothed out? What happens to difference in these encounters? And is equality possible? Ethics here becomes more about a deep responsiveness, a responsibility, and an attentiveness to others, a disposition to the unknowability of the other in order to nourish its difference, not to make it into the same, but to hold on to that incommensurability. And that is the difference or inability for comparison or measurement against something that isn't itself. So Karen Barad, who is a critical post-human theorist, such as those that we discussed last week, considers that ethics is not simply about responsible actions in relation to human experiences of the world, but rather it's a question of material entanglements and how each interaction matters in the reconfiguring of these entanglements. That is, it's a matter of the ethical call that is embodied in the very worlding of the world. And again, post-human theory argues that it's not only about the human, it enables thinking about human and more than human bodies and worlds together in intradependencies, not only necessarily smooth or pure or easy relations. These are often toxic dependencies, damaged relations, because the world is too complex to assume that creating a relation is an act of purity or that it will be easy. This notion is much more difficult. So this invites thinking about the political natures of relationality, of intersections, of flows and blockages between bodies. So something to consider here is that in socially constructing knowledge and becoming permeable to others, composing knowledges that are relationally driven, there's no neutrality here when bodies meet. Power is always present and being mitigated between things. It's always active and non-neutral.